At the death of Henry Tudor on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VIII succeeded to the throne. He had been left a kingdom in extremely good order by his father. Financially, politically and socially, England was at peace with itself and in a position of strength. Only 2 months after he became king, after a certain amount of diplomatic wrangling about the dowry, Henry VIII married the woman he loved, his brother's widow, Katherine of Aragon. And within 2 years, she had borne him an apparently healthy son. Everything looked rosy for the young couple on the throne of England. And here at Hampton Court Palace, built by Cardinal Wolsey beside the River Thames, will serve as a suitable backdrop to tell the story of the first part of Henry VIII's eventful reign. But after much celebration, less than 2 months after he was born, the new young prince suddenly died. But Catherine was young and would surely bring forth another heir to the throne. But the new learning and spirit of adventure was beginning to bring unrest into the nations of continental Europe. Henry went to France, leaving Catherine in charge of affairs in England, and she proved herself an extremely capable substitute for the king when the Scots invaded the north of England, and she dispatched an army which at Flodden Field killed 10,000 Scotsmen, including the King James IV and husband of Henry's elder sister Margaret, and most of the nobility, bringing Henry a much-needed respite to the threat of usurpation of the Tudor crown from the north. And the Queen was delighted to send this letter to her husband, telling him all about it. Henry had crossed the Channel to meet the King of France, because Spain and France were competing for the control of the papacy in Rome in order to gain power. Henry VII had seen Britain's role as preventing one or the other from becoming too powerful. After a few years of having fun throwing off the shackles of repression imposed on him by a very strict father, Henry VIII was beginning to take kingship and the security of his realm very seriously. While Henry was in France, a well-educated, able and ambitious gentleman, the son of an Ipswich butcher, by very efficiently administering in France the affairs of the king's household, brought himself into the king's favour. His name was Thomas Wolsey, and Wolsey could see exactly the sense of the policy which Henry VII had started, and was soon seen by the king as exactly the right man to have at his right hand to pursue and achieve that balance of power. Like Henry himself, Thomas Wolsey was a very large, flamboyant man with an enormous ego. Almost 20 years older than Henry, he was ordained at the age of 25, and 16 years later became the Archbishop of York. The following year he was created a cardinal by Pope Leo X, enabling him to appoint himself to enormously lucrative administrative positions at Bath and Wells, Durham and Winchester, thus becoming even richer than the king. The following year he was made Lord Chancellor, replacing the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Wareham. Wolsey delivered what Henry wanted. The two of them ruled England. For the first 7 years of his reign, Henry had plenty of money. But after 7 years he'd used it all up, and the only way to get more money from the people of England was for the king to convene Parliament. But Henry was beginning to prove himself the tyrant that he would become later in his reign. He had set aside all of the parliamentary processes while he still had money, including the petitions, processes which all the free men of England were beginning to enjoy and to be able to rely on. The best Wolsey could get from Parliament was half what Henry wanted. The Speaker of the House of Commons was Thomas More. In 1516, More had published Utopia, which was being read and discussed enthusiastically throughout the whole of Britain. Only 3 years earlier, Machiavelli had published his tract on how to promote dependency and fear as a form of government, and that was much more Henry's style. But Henry also had an inquiring mind. What Wycliffe and the Lollards had started could no longer be suppressed. For the first time in England, there was widespread ideological discussion about forms of government, permitted and participated in by the young king himself. A discussion, of course, strictly prohibited on mainland Europe by the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, and punished ruthlessly by the Spanish Inquisition. But Thomas Wolsey only retained the favour of the king while he could keep supplying what the king required, and he'd failed to get Parliament to agree to provide the funds which the king had asked for. Meanwhile, the Queen, Katherine, had been trying in vain to produce sons and heirs. In addition to a number of miscarriages, Katherine had borne Henry 6 children, only one of whom survived beyond infancy, a daughter called Mary. The king's genuine affection for his queen began to wear thin when she couldn't give him a son, and he began to look around for someone who could. When he finally settled on Anne Boleyn, Henry wanted an end to his marriage with Katherine, and it was up to Thomas Wolsey to find a way of bringing that about. And finally, Wolsey's political ingenuity let him down. Behind me now is Catherine of Aragon's house in Ludlow, where she and Arthur lived just after they got married. The issue confronting Wolsey was that, amidst all of the magic and mystery of medieval medicine, it was believed that Katherine was cursed because she'd married her dead husband's brother. Remember the power of the Church. In the rather quaint language of the King James Bible, in Leviticus chapter 18, we're told that it is forbidden for a man to marry his brother's wife. "Ah," said Henry, "that explains why she has not been able to bear me a son." But Katherine could counter with Deuteronomy chapter 25, which says that if a man dies, his brother has a duty to look after his dead brother's wife, and he shall give her children. The impasse between them was absolute, but Katherine had influential family friends. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was her nephew. And early in 1527, Charles seized control of Rome and effectively imprisoned Pope Clement. After 2 years of fruitless toing and froing of emissaries and messages between Rome and England, initiated by Wolsey between 1527 and 1529, Katherine finally appealed to the Pope for the case to be heard in Rome. In these circumstances, the king realized that the Pope would never give him an annulment of his marriage with Katherine. The already bruised relationship between the king and his Chancellor Wolsey was now in its closing stages. Wolsey had miscalculated Henry's determination to marry Anne Boleyn. The marriage took place in secret before the divorce, and the king began to look for a replacement for his political fixer. Wolsey could see that his power over the nation and over the king was diminishing when the king began to refuse to sign his letters unseen. Back at Hampton Court, when Henry VIII began to take a really good look at the renovations and the extension at Hampton Court that had been done by Cardinal Wolsey with funds from the Roman Catholic Church, he began to realise just how rich the Roman Church was becoming as a result of the income from the monasteries in England. And when Wolsey began to fall out of favour at the end of the 1520s, the Cardinal was very quick to say to the King, "Of course, Your Majesty, I was only renovating it and rebuilding it in order to present it to you." But it was too little, too late. Wolsey was stripped of all his seals of office and his incomes, and Henry made Thomas More his new Lord Chancellor. Henry took possession of all Wolsey's assets, with the exception of the Archbishopric of York, which is where he was allowed to retire, only to be called back to London the following year to answer further charges. A broken man, he died on that return journey. As an aside, just before we leave these magnificent grounds, we've probably all heard the story of the American tourist who looked at the lawns at Hampton Court and he said, "Gee, how do you make a lawn like that?" And he was told, "You cut it and you roll it regularly." "Gee, I do that at home on my own lawn, but it don't look like this one." "You do it for 500 years, sir."